Hello, my name is Brian Klaus, and I'm the Executive Director of the Veterans Legal Support Center at the John Marshall Law School in Chicago, Illinois. This section is going to discuss the various employment and reemployment rights available to National Guard, Reserve Component members, and active duty members under the Uniformed Service Members Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. If you're following along in the American Bar Association's Legal Guide for Military Families, this is in the chapter entitled Employment Rights. You don't need that book to follow along. I'll try and explain everything in this presentation. The first thing we should discuss is the history of the National Guard and the reserve components of the Armed Forces of the United States. As we all remember from our history books, the militias were the ones who answered the call and fought the British in the War of Independence. We heard about them as things like the Minutemen and the other soldiers who fought the British in an irregular war in the middle of the 1770s. That tradition continued throughout the entire 19th century. Militias were organized at the state level, often by private parties. They were essentially small local armies, and they were the first ones to answer the call. During the War of Independence, during the War of 1812, here in the Midwest, during the Black Hawk Wars in the 1830s, the militias were the first to respond. When the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter and the Union had to raise armies, the first ones to respond were state militias. These state militias were able to hold off the Confederate armies until a sufficient number of Union forces could be raised, and we all know from our history books what happened then. At the close of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, Congress reviewed the militias and figured out that that was an antiquated way of approaching military defense, to have a bunch of state-level armies with minimal training, lightly equipped, being called upon to defend the country. And the militias were disbanded around the beginning of the 20th century, and the National Guard was created. Shortly thereafter, the reserve components were created. So first, let's discuss the National Guard. We've seen the commercials. We have an idea of a couple of things that the National Guard does. But it's initially important to understand what the National Guard is as far as who controls the National Guard. The National Guard is unique in the American military. It has two leadership structures. There's the state level and there's the federal level. The state level, it is the commander-in-chief of the National Guard is the governor. Here in Illinois, our governor commands the National Guard of well over 10,000 members between the National Guard, which is part of the Army, and the Air Guard, part of the Air Force. The National Guard on a state level responds to state-specific issues, be it a flood, a tornado, a hurricane, anything like that. Say the police department needs supplemental forces because of an emergency, they'll send MPs out. There's all sorts of examples of what the National Guard does on a state level. We saw it during Katrina, during the recent tornadoes in the Midwest, during the hurricane out east last year. That's got nothing to do, or very little to do, with the Army structure. Now, as a federal force, the National Guard is another reserve component of the Army and the Air Guard of the Air Force. So what that means is they can be federally activated. Those of you watching this have probably heard of a National Guard unit that was activated in your state, because most National Guard units have been activated for Iraq or Afghanistan and have deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan or other areas of the world. When they're called into federal service, National Guard troops are under the command of the Army. The governor is and the state forces are no longer part of that command structure. Once you go, it's pretty obvious. Washington, D.C. trumps the state capital. So when you're called into federal service, you have certain rights under the Uniformed Service Members Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. Given that long name, that's why we call it USERRA for short, USERRA. And you'll find it if you're Googling it at 43 United States Code 4300 and all the ones that follow that. We'll get to that a little further into this presentation. Now, the National Guard is a dual state-federal force. The reserve components are different. They are strictly federal forces. And they were created on the eve of World War I, similar to how the National Guard was created. And at that time, it was an Army Reserve and a Navy Reserve. There was also a Marine Corps Reserve. Following the end of World War II, the Air Force was created. So the Air Force Reserve was created and the Air Guard was created. We now also have a Coast Guard Reserve because the Coast Guard is now part of the Department of Defense. With the passage of the National Guard Act at the beginning of the 20th century, those state militias were formed into the dual state-federal forces that I just discussed. They were then used in World War I, where National Guard units comprised nearly a majority of the fighting units that went to Europe in 1917. National Guard units were the first units to respond after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the beginning of World War II. After the Navy got attacked, they were some of the first units to fight the enemy and to take casualties. And just like in the Civil War, they bought time for a nation that was not ready for war, to prepare for war and to fight that war. Following World War II, National Guard units were again activated for Korea. Following the Korean War, National Guard units were not activated in great numbers. Not a lot of them were sent to Vietnam. They weren't really called upon until Desert Storm. With Desert Storm, National Guard units and reserve units were activated in great numbers, fought in the Middle East, and then returned home. And it's the employment issues that National Guard and Reserve members had during Desert Storm that caused Congress to review just what the laws were that protected our service members when they were called to duty. And there weren't a tremendous number. And Congress responded in the early 90s with the Uniformed Service Members Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. And there's two components to that act that we'll talk about in a moment. Around the time of Desert Storm, there was also another important historical event. The Berlin Wall fell and the Eastern Bloc collapsed. The Soviet Union disbanded, and we were left with a Europe that we had not known in the post-war era. Washington responded by dramatically reducing the number of active duty members of the armed forces. Approximately 25% of forces were drawn down. The powers that be in Washington saw that there was not going to be another great big European war where we had to have divisions waiting in Germany and all the other Western countries for the Russians to invade. Berlin was opened up, Europe was free, they were unifying, and there were no threats on the horizon. And then came the Gulf War, and Congress saw the problems that employees and employers were having with soldiers who were called to active duty as National Guard or Reserve component members. So Congress passed USERRA, and it was largely untested until September 12th, 2001, because we all know what happened. The attack on the World Trade Center, and the following day, we had National Guard members in our airports, guarding our power plants, our nuclear storage facilities, our water treatment plants. Everybody got activated because something was up, there was an attack, we didn't know where we were going to have to respond. Air crews were put in the air, sent overseas, everybody was activated.